And Jake is going to be heading up to the EDF office in SF, and he will meet with Rod, who many of you met a couple of weeks ago for our retreat. So we're really psyched to have him here and get his insights. This is something that I'm trying to learn more about myself. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you all for coming out tonight. So Rod came to visit you guys recently. I want you to know there will be no meditation tonight. That's a Rod thing. Also, just a word of warning, I'm on the tail end of a cold. I'm actually feeling quite good, but my voice is struggling a little bit. So by the time 45 or 50 minutes roll by, I may be rasping like you. I'll apologize in advance for that. One other thing just to start off, I wasn't sure exactly how to pitch this talk. I wasn't sure what the audience would be like. You know, fisheries experts, I feel, are especially prone to getting very wonky, very technical, very jargony. I've tried to avoid that, although from what Jason tells me, most of you have a pretty good background in fisheries. So hopefully a lot of the terminology I'll use will be familiar with. If I come across anything that I think is, might be a little out there, I'll try to stop and define terms as needed. But it's a small enough group, and if I say something that makes no sense, feel free to raise your hand. Clarifying questions I'm happy to address along the way, so you're not sitting there lost and confused. I think we have time at the end for some more substantive Q&A. Okay, all that said, I'm going to get into it. So I'm here to talk about fisheries management. These are a series of photos, all of which I think I took, from different fisheries from where I'm from. So I live in New Hampshire, I grew up in Connecticut, so I'm a New Englander. Most of these are New England fisheries. This one down here is actually a blue crab in South Carolina, but these are all East Coast fisheries. The reason I'm putting them up is to kind of give a sense of the diversity and breadth of fisheries. So you've got very small scale operations, much larger scale vessels. In the middle and the top is my good friend Glenn, landing a bluefish, so recreational fisheries. Some very high value, some very low value, some used for human consumption, others used for other needs. And this is all just on the East Coast. And you expand this globally, and this is an incredibly diverse sector. It's also for many people, excuse me, a really important sector. Worldwide, there's about 3 billion people, so something just under half of the world population that rely on fish as a key source of protein. Don't ask me what a key source of protein is. I think the definition is something like 20%, give or take, of your animal protein comes from fish. Now that number is expected to grow to about 4.5 billion by 2050. So a 50% increase. Now that rate of increase is more than the expected growth of the global population. The reason for that is because the people that are heavily dependent on fish for their nutrition are really disproportionately concentrated in the world's poorest regions, places like Africa, Asia, Latin America, that are going to grow at a higher rate than the global average. So we're going to see, we already have a lot of people in the world that depend on fish for food, and we're going to have many more by the century. It's also, though, a major economic driver. Worldwide, wild fisheries generate something in the order of $100 billion in revenue throughout the supply chain. When I first read this figure, I actually thought it sounded low. I think it's a hard figure to calculate, but even if it's right, I mean that's a massive scale. And there's about 260 million people worldwide that are employed in marine fishery-related sectors. That includes not only the fishermen and women who go out to sea and catch fish, but people who maintain boats and sell ice and fix nets and are employed throughout the supply chain. It's also a really core component of coastal heritage in most ways. So where I come from in New England, this is arguably the most important contribution to fisheries. There are certainly ports in New England for which fishing is a major economic driver. For the region as a whole, it's actually not. But anywhere you go in New England, at least along the coast, the heritage, the art, the literature, the cuisine, just kind of the vibe is often tied up in our fishing past. All right. So that's kind of why we're looking at these issues. This is a somewhat dated figure produced by the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, showing the worldwide trend in global fish catch. That's the light blue area on the plot. The darker blue is the trend in aquaculture production. I'm not actually planning to talk about aquaculture, although we can get into it if you'd like in the Q&A. But what you'll notice, though, is that aquaculture is on the up and up and up. And I think more up-to-date figures now would show that aquaculture production and marine fish capture are about equal. Here, wild fish capture is still greater than aquaculture production, but I think aquaculture is now caught up. But what you can see is that wild fish capture, steadily increased from mid-1900s up to somewhere around the late 80s, early 90s. And since then, it's kind of flattened out. It's somewhere in the ballpark of 90 million metric tons worldwide. But what this doesn't show, though, is that while that catch has flattened out and remained relatively constant at the global scale, the number of vessels, the size of vessels, and just the effort taken to produce that catch has gone up and up and up. So this suggests things are fairly stable, and in fact, they're not. Fishing fleets worldwide are having to work harder to produce the same amount of catch that they've been producing for the last few decades. So what that means is underlying that capture trend is a decrease in the abundance of fish in the water. Now, there's been multiple efforts to kind of calculate, well, what's going on then in the water. That's the catch is looking at what comes out, what's going on in the water. There was a famous, or perhaps more accurately, infamous paper produced by Boris Worm at Dalhousie University and his colleague about a decade ago that came up with what in my view was a somewhat ill-advised and irresponsible prediction that by 2048 there would be no fish in the sea. They looked at the trend over time and the percentage of fisheries that had collapsed, that had reached less than 10% of their maximum catch. And then they extrapolated that trend out and it crossed the axis of 2048. So added this into their paper, it got all sorts of headlines, created all sorts of controversy. Many people have actually written off this paper because of that, which is kind of a shame. Other than that, it's actually a pretty good, interesting paper. But anyways, this kind of was the dominant picture for a little while. But many within the fisheries science community kind of pushed back on this message, challenged their assumptions, challenged their methods. What ended up happening was many of the authors of this paper got together with their critics and had sort of a kumbaya moment down at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis in Santa Barbara, and produced sort of a follow-up study that gave a somewhat different picture. And this is one of the figures from that follow-up paper. So this is what we call a Cody plot. You see these all the time in fisheries. It shows on the, excuse me, on the x-axis the relative biomass, so the relative abundance of fish. And I say relative because it's the actual estimated abundance of a given fish stock relative to the target. So all these fisheries have a target biomass they want to maintain. So where that vertical dashed line is at 1.0, that's fisheries on one side of it are at or above their biomass target, on the other side they're below it. The y-axis then is the relative fishing mortality rate, so how hard that stock is being fished. And again, it's the same thing. It's how hard it's actually being fished relative to the target that's determined to be sustainable. Here it's the opposite. You actually want to be below that dashed line. So you don't want to be fishing any harder than the target. So the ideal place, and each one of these points is a different fishery. So the ideal place to be is over in this quadrant. So where you're above, you're at or above your biomass target, and you're at or below your mortality target. That upper left, that's the bad place. That's where you have too few fish and you're fishing them too hard. The somewhat encouraging message to come out of this plot is that the center of mass, and that's what this kind of egg yolk is representing, is the density distribution of these plots. The center of mass is in this lower right, this lower, left quadrant. So what that means is while many of these fish stocks are not at the level of abundance we'd like them to be at, we've actually been successful at bringing down the fishing mortality rate. And that means over time, those points should start to drift over and get to where we want them to be. So this is a somewhat more optimistic view. Not entirely. There's still a lot of fisheries that are below excuse me, their biomass levels, still many that are being fished too hard. But it's a bit rosier picture than the 2048 prediction. I actually think this is too optimistic, and I'll talk about the reasons for that in a moment. And the truth probably lies somewhere in between. So, another study that came out last year, done by Chris Costello and his colleagues at UCal Santa Barbara, tried to look at, okay, well, where are we in global fisheries production, but also where can we go? So, this series of gray points is a series of estimates at the global scale of the total biomass, relative biomass of world fisheries. And they had data up through about 2014 or so. After that, all those colored lines are different potential trajectories for where we might go based on different approaches to management. I'm not going to get into the details of what they modeled, but they concluded that if we do the right things, particularly if we follow that blue trajectory, we can recover a tremendous amount of biomass, tremendous amount of catch, and tremendous amount of revenue. So we can have this kind of triple bottom line outcome for fisheries where excuse me, we're producing food, we're producing jobs, we're producing money, and we're also recovering these stocks in our ecosystems. So with that sort of background, the question I wanted to try to explore was, okay, if that's the future we want to have, if that's the future we can have, what's it going to take to get there? So what do we really need to manage fisheries with? So the central question I try to tackle in this study is what are the key elements of success in fisheries management? Now, not surprisingly, I'm not the first person to ask this question. It's asked really every day by fisheries practitioners around the world. But what I did was I went to 10 papers that have actually tried to tackle this question in a very holistic way. So if you look at the fisheries literature, you can find dozens, if not hundreds of papers on any particular aspect of fisheries science or management. It's actually been a surprisingly small number that have tried to look at that management system as a whole and answer the question, what does it really take to get management right? So these papers were published in some of the highest rated journals by some of the most well-known scientists in the world. Many of them are cited hundreds, if not thousands of times. They've got a lot of attention. So I figured, all right, well, let's grab these high-profile papers that have tried to tackle this question and extract the answers from them. Let's see what the aggregate answer from this set of studies is. As you might guess, when I did that, based on the talk, the title of the talk, I came up with 8 kind of core pieces of a management system, what I'm calling the 8 pillars. So what I'm going to do for the majority of the rest of the talk is sort of step through those and talk a little bit about each. Now, every one of these could be the topic of a talk in its own right. So I'm going to kind of discuss them at a very high and somewhat superficial level, but I'm going to draw upon some of the scholarship that's been done to understand these different pillars, draw upon some case studies that illustrate them, and then I'll offer a few closing thoughts. So, the first of these pillars is that good fishery management system needs to have a transparent, and this is important, participatory decision-making process. Now, it turns out we didn't need all these high-falutin fishery science to tell us this. We actually had a Nobel laureate economist who spent the majority of her career, this is Ostrom, late Ostrom, who spent the majority of her career asking this very question, how do you effectively govern a common property resource? What are the components of good governance? And her work was broad, so I'm going to really overgeneralize, but a good chunk of it focused on this decision-making process. One of her most famous contributions is these 8 design principles. So if you want to design a governance system for common property resources, you want to have these 8. The fact that she came up with 8 and I came up with 8 could be a coincidence, or maybe it would be like a Nobel Prize. I doubt that. But anyway, so if you read through these though, they all really, for the most part, focus on that decision-making process. So, you know, matching the rules with the needs and conditions in a given context. Ensuring that those affected by the rules can participate in the decision-making. Making sure that the rule-making rights are respected by external authorities, whether that's other agencies, higher levels of governments, and so on. So, you know, a lot of what she offered us was the guidelines for how the decision-making process should look. One thing I've learned in my time working in fisheries is that if I were to add a ninth here, it might be mechanisms for evolving your decision-making process. So, you know, the management that emerges from this process is going to change through time, but that process itself sometimes needs to change. As an example of that, so about a decade ago, when Congress last reauthorized the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the primary statute governing fisheries management in the U.S., one of the big changes they implemented was a requirement for fisheries to now have annual catch limits. That actually wasn't a requirement beforehand. Fisheries weren't required to catch, now they were. Actually went even a step further. It required that these catch limits have uncertainty buffers, precautionary buffers added into them. So the idea was fishery scientists get together, they try to come up with the best estimate they can of what's a sustainable level of catch, but then recognizing that there's profound uncertainties that go into that assessment. So trying to then gauge those uncertainties and back off that catch accordingly. If you have a fishery where the science is quite strong and we're confident in it, you might have a very thin buffer. On the other hand, if there's a lot of uncertainties and we don't want to put a lot of stock, unintended, into that catch limit, then it might be a bigger buffer. So that was a big change. Another big change, though, was that they actually separated out the responsibility for setting those catch limits from the responsibility for really developing just about everything else in the management program. So the regional fishery management councils, there's 8 of them around the U.S., and these are the primary management body at the federal level, had long had what were known as SSC, Scientific and Statistical Committees. So they're primary scientific advisors. In many places, certainly where I'm from in New England, they were hardly used though. Every once in a while they might ask for their take on some controversial new study that came out, but by and large they existed in name only. When the act was reauthorized, it actually gave these scientific bodies the authority to set the catch limit. And so it really brought science into the process in a much stronger way, and I will talk about that a bit more later. Another really important thing he did though, and this to me was a good example of evolving a decision-making process based on experience. It separated out the responsibility for setting a catch limit from the responsibility for allocating the catch. And that's a hard thing to ask the same body to do. So if these councils have to make decisions about how much of the catch goes to the recreational sector versus the commercial sector versus maybe another fishery that catches the stock as bycatch, so those sorts of difficult political decisions, there's a lot of incentive to make the catch limit as high as possible because it means those difficult decisions aren't as hard. And I think over time, many fishery analysts kind of learn, you really want to separate out those functions. And so have one group set the limit, hand that decision off, and have another figure out how to divide that. So this to me was a good example, I thought, of a decision-making process evolving based on experience. I threw myself in there because I actually chaired the New England SSC for a while, which meant I spent a lot of years sitting right in the middle of this process, chairing the committee and then reporting its decisions to the council, which opened my eyes, and this could be a whole talk in itself about sort of how decisions are made, and really, I guess to speak to this pillar, the importance of I think I learned that how a decision is made can often be as important, and sometimes even more important than what the decision actually is. But okay, on to the next one. If I can speed these up a little. The second one kind of surprised me was have a fishery management plan. This sort of seemed obvious. Did this really need to be said? But then I thought about it. There are plenty of fisheries around the world that do not actually have management. And made me think about one actually that I had been involved in. Does anyone know where that is? Off on the west coast. That is the island of Nantucket. It's I don't know, some 50 miles off of Cape Cod, kind of out in the middle of the Atlantic. Possibly the easternmost point in the U.S. Eastport, Maine, and Nantucket dispute which one is actually furthest east. But anyway, a cool little island that I've spent a lot of time on over the years. Very popular destination for summer homes. So at the peak of summertime, there could be upwards of 10,000 people on this little island. Nantucket is only 15 miles long at its maximum point, by maybe 4 miles wide. So not a big island, but it can be crammed with summer residents and tourists. Beautiful beaches. This is a rare shot of one with no one on them. These beaches can get pretty crowded in the summer. A lot of boating that takes place. The harbor just fills up. Pleasure yachts. There's whale watching. So it's a big summertime economy. The thing is, though, when summer winds down, all that kind of goes away. The year-round population now is only about 3,000 people, and their economic opportunities shrink considerably when the peak season's over. But one that they do have that is actually an important economic driver on the island is its bay scallop fishery. So bay scallops are a tiny species of scallop that used to support fisheries up and down the east coast of the U.S. In most places, they've been either completely extirpated or at least depleted to a point that they're not completely. Nantucket is the one place that actually still has a viable wild bay scallop fishery. Delicious little critter. This is a bay scallop. You can see it has beautiful blue eyes. Like most scallops, they can swim, which is kind of cool. They look like little Pac-Mans. Anyway, it has both a recreational and a commercial component to this fishery. That photo is actually me doing some recreational scalloping. So you put on your waders and you kind of push a rake and fill up this basket with scallops. But many islanders who in the summertime are driving taxi cabs or bartending or working other jobs, in the wintertime, this is a winter fishery, buy a license and go scalloping. And it generates somewhere in the ballpark of $2 million in revenue. And that's just the sale for the commercial sales. And then there's kind of cottage industries that have popped up around the recreational fishery where people will actually make their trip down after the summer peak to participate in this fishery. So it's an important off-season economic driver on this island. Over time, though, the landings have gone down, as you can see from those fisheries. They really peaked back in the late 70s and early 80s, kind of came down, showed a little bit of a recovery, came down again, and started bouncing along somewhere in the ballpark, this is bushels, by the way, in the ballpark of 10 to 20,000 bushels ever since. And it seems fairly stable at that level, but the fact that it's gone through such a dramatic decline, has the island worried. They're not necessarily expecting to build back up to these levels, but they don't want to go away. And when you see some of these really down years, that scares them, and that has an economic impact. So they decided, and for years they didn't have a management plan. So they decided a few years ago to put one together, to actually be much more strategic about how they protect and try to recover this resource. So I was fortunate enough to work with them on this, and in 2012, Nantucket produced its first shellfish management plan. This is a document of nearly 200 pages, which to me was surprising given that it's a fairly small fishery, but it's chock full of information. So it's got information on the number of participants in the fishery. That plot in the upper left shows the number of commercial licenses, recreational licenses, resident and non-resident licenses. So what's been the participation? A lot on the ecosystem. There's the bottom left imagery. This map here shows where eelgrass beds are. This species is inextricably tied to eelgrass. The juveniles actually settle onto the blade of the eelgrass. What that does is it keeps them high enough off the bottom that crabs can't eat them, or at least eat too many of them, but also gives them some shelter from diving ducks. So they're kind of attacked from both sides. And the juveniles will attack right in the middle of the blade of eelgrass to minimize that predation until they're big enough to drop off and not be susceptible. Anyway, that photo there shows some of the pleasure yachts and the stars that their anchor chains produce in these eelgrass beds. So, and this is just a sample. There's tons of information on this fishery, all in one place. So anyone who wants to learn about bay scallops and bay scallop fishery, you now have a one-stop shop. But more importantly, with all this information now brought together and sort of synthesized, the island was able to put together this 30-page matrix of recommended actions for protecting and recovering this fishery. This is just a handful of them. They include, obviously management of the fishery itself, habitat, education, business planning, everything. So it really allowed the community to bring its knowledge together collectively and come up with a prioritized list of strategies. So, like I said, this plan was produced in 2012. When I finished that project, I kind of, unfortunately, had to walk away and do other things. But in thinking about this talk, I wrote to the town shellfish biologist and I said, so it's been 5 years. Is the management plan doing anything? And this was her response. I figured her words would be more useful than mine. She said, yes, the SMP is alive and active. The Marine Department's been implementing that priority recommendation matrix. It's been useful for research. And her view is that management really is improving. They're not seeing the response yet in the resource because that takes time. So as you start to remove some of these impacts, it takes time for the eelgrass beds that have been scarred or otherwise lost to come back. It takes time for the scallops to settle and grow. But Tara, who I can tell you is not an inherently sort of Pollyannish person. This was far more enthusiastic and optimistic than I was expecting. And it really showed me what can happen by just simply having management. Okay. So that was a long story to make what might be an obvious point, but again, there's a lot of fisheries out there that don't even have a management plan. And those studies that I looked at, several of them suggested having that plan. All right, so moving on. The next pillar was making sure that the management is at the appropriate scale or scales. So the implication there is sometimes management needs to happen at multiple scales. These are spatial scales. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is a map that shows some of the major regional fishery management organizations around the world. These are multinational compacts that were created to try to manage things like tunas, billfishes, pelagic sharks, whales. The International Whaling Commission is an RFMO. Species that range over vast areas and therefore cut across the territorial waters of multiple nations and even out into the high seas. So really, these RFMOs were created to address this pillar, to make sure that the management of these species was taking place at the scale at which their life histories are operating. But this actually cuts both directions. So this is a map of the Philippines. And what you can see is the Philippines, there's other places around the world that have this same sort of look, Indonesia and other kind of archipelagic locations, where you have this real complex array of islands and bays, many of them surrounded by coral reefs, so you have fisheries that are concentrated in relatively small habitat patches. Sort of the exact opposite of tunas ranging across the entire North Atlantic. These are populations that actually exist and operate at very, very small scales, although they are connected. So you actually have kind of a multi-scale problem. You have a population of reef fish that largely might live in a reef the size of this room, but through dispersal of their young could be connected to one 50 miles away. And that poses a real management challenge. If you're just managing at that larger scale, you're going to miss important things that are happening at smaller scales. On the other hand, if you're just managing at the smaller scale, you're going to miss the connections that are taking place. So it's in these types of fisheries in particular that multi-scale approaches are needed, and including a very fine, granular level of management. Now, that raises real challenges. When you're trying to manage at this very small scale, you're sort of replicating the same management needs and challenges over and over again. Jeremy Prince, who is a fairly well-known Australian fishery scientist, tried to tackle this problem. Tried to ask, well, how can we deal with that? So he came up with this sort of conceptualization of the problem. What he's trying to illustrate here is across the bottom you have these, what he's calling microstocks, these little populations that might exist in a single reef or in a bay, but are replicated over and over and over across the Philippines, across Indonesia, across the length of the Great Barrier Reef, etc. Oftentimes, those very small, fine-scale populations and the fishing villages that rely on them are overseen by a single central government who has a massive job for it. And especially if we're in developing regions where resources are scant, it can be nearly impossible for a single under-resourced agency to manage so many small populations, so many disaggregated fishing villages to do that effectively. So his proposal was, well, we need to flip this. What we need is for the local level to be where most management happens, and to have those central authorities kind of provide support, create the overarching policies perhaps, provide resources, provide training, but have a lot of it really play out at the local level by the users themselves. He was really focusing on how to do fisheries science, but the idea is kind of mapped nicely onto the rest of the management system as well. And this is really taking us to this concept of co-management, where you actually have the fishermen and the users become an integral part of the management process. One point I meant to make at the beginning, but the point I just made reminds me, you'll find when I'm discussing these various pillars that actually many of them overlap with one another. There's a lot of connections among them. So, here I'm talking about this pillar that deals with scale, but in doing so, we kind of have to talk about a decision-making process. So what Jeremy is proposing is a decision-making process that addresses the problem scale. Okay, I need to speed this up. The next one, I was glad to see this from a ton of scientists. So, good fisheries management needs to have a strong scientific basis to it. What that primarily means is setting management targets, what fishing mortality rate we want to keep within, how much biomass we want in the water, what's the status of our fishery relative to those targets, and what kind of limits do we need to put in place based on the alignment or lack thereof between the target and status. Excuse me. It may seem, again, kind of obvious and intuitive that science will help fisheries be more successful. But scientists, being scientists, looked at this question anyway, just to be sure. So these are some figures from a paper that Ray Hilborn at the University of Washington and Dan Armando at UCal Santa Barbara produced a couple years ago, where they were looking at the performance of fisheries. They looked at it around the world. I just took some of their results from the U.S. East Coast and West Coast. How have fisheries that actually have a stock assessment program in place fared over time? And so this shows the relative fishing mortality rate, again, one being your actual mortality rate is about where you want to be. Above that, you're fishing too hard. So they looked over a series of decades on both coasts at how that relative fishing mortality rate was performing in response to these stock assessment programs. And what you can see is that, first of all, you guys on the West Coast tend to do better than we do. There's reasons for that, though. We can get into that later if you like. But the more important result was that through time, things got better. Even on the East Coast, where we have more struggling fisheries, the mortality rate overall came down and kind of started to tuck nicely underneath that threshold. So they argued that this shows that when you actually put into place a robust assessment program, you're actually going to get to management outcomes that you want. Now, that will work where you have an assessment program. These figures were from a paper that Chris Costello and some of his colleagues produced a few years ago. What they tried to do was look at the status of fisheries that don't have stock assessments, which, on the surface is sort of an odd question to ask, because we determine how fisheries are doing based on stock assessment. So if you don't have a stock assessment, how do you know? And they were very creative. They actually used fisheries with stock assessments and found some very strong correlations between things like catch trends, life history trades, and some other more readily accessible metrics that let them gauge how these unassessed fisheries, what shape they were probably in. So this panel on the left, the dark line is the trend in relative biomass for fisheries that have a stock assessment program in place. And you can see that it's very flat and it's close to 1, so they're generally doing well. The dashed line is the trend for the unassessed fisheries using their model. What you can see is that has been steadily declining through time. So it's sort of the flip side, is that where you have an assessment program in place, you'll get to where you want to go. If you don't, though, it looks like things kind of get steadily worse and worse. So what that means is, okay, we need more fishery science, we need more stock assessments. Well, that's not necessarily as easy as it sounds. This is the cover and the last page of the 2012 Gulf of Maine cod stock assessment. You can't actually see what I wanted to illustrate, but this number here, the last page, is 601. So there's 601 pages in the stock assessment. On this last page is figure A.7.35. What that means is Appendix 7, figure 35. So there were 35 figures in Appendix 7 alone. Forget Appendixes 1 through 6 and the main text. What this means is this thing has a ton of information. And over time, I think unintentionally, we've kind of built up almost an expectation that stock assessment has to be an incredibly data-intensive, data-hungry endeavor. Now, if you're living in a wealthy country like the US, working in a place like New England where the species diversity is relatively low, you can do these kinds of stock assessments for most species. But if you move to places like the developing tropics, where your resources, your financial resources are less, but the number of species are much higher, this ain't gonna work. And this is probably why we have so many unassessed fisheries. We've sort of built up an approach and an expectation that doesn't work for most places in the world. Fortunately, we actually have at our disposal a growing toolbox of approaches that are much less data intensive, and that can still be quite useful. So, Kristen Honey, who wrote this paper when she was a fellow with EDF a few years ago, looked at the range of these data-limited assessment tools out there. She came up with this sort of, I like this onion concept where you've got sort of different layers of the onion that reflect different degrees of data quantity and quality. But what she was really trying to do was create a framework that said, look, here's a bunch of different types of data you may or may not have. See what you've got, and then work through this. I'm not going to go into detail, but it will tell you what tools you can use for the data you have. It can also then tell you if you want to use a more sophisticated approach, what do you now need to add into your data system. So this has been, I think, one of the most important and most exciting directions fishery science has gone in the last few years, is really trying to get much simpler, trying to develop and test and implement approaches that don't have the same kind of data demands like that cod assessment. Another interesting idea that, as far as I know, hasn't been implemented yet, but it's been discussed a bit in literature, is using marine protected areas as a reference point. So marine protected areas, you probably know, are essentially underwater parks. You draw a line and you say, I'm not going to have any fishing or oil drilling or other impacts here. Maybe some tourism, but this is going to be kind of a nature preserve. What that means is that the populations in those protected areas should be something close to a natural density. So what more and more people are proposing is that if you go and you estimate the density of fish in a reserve and compare that to the density outside the reserve, you can use that as a gauge for how healthy your fishery is. Now, you're not expecting fishing grounds to have as many fish as the reserve. The only way to do that is to stop fishing. But you might want to be somewhere in the ballpark of 50 to 60%. If you find you're drifting down toward 30%, 20%, 10%, then maybe you have a problem and you need to back off fishing pressure. So that's an interesting idea that like I said, as far as I know, has not been implemented yet, but I think has real potential. It's not all that hard to jump in the water with a scuba gear or even just a snorkel and count fish. I did it for years. Actually kind of fun. So, you know, you can get these data quickly. You can do a quick survey in a reserve, do a quick survey outside, compare the two, and now you have something that you can start using to make future decisions. Okay, so once you've done that science, whether it's using these really data-hungry complex models or a simpler method, you now know something about the status of your resources and the limits you might need to put in place. But now you actually have to implement those, and that's when we get to this next point, which is having effective controls of fishing capacity and harvest. Often that is codified in something we call a harvest control rule. These simple plots here, this is something I learned through my service on the SSC, are, well, first of all, perhaps the most important graph you will have in a fishery management program. It's really where science most directly meets policy in my view in the management process. So what these control rules do is they relate biomass of fish in the water to the target fishing mortality we're going to try to impose on the stock. So you can see that as the biomass goes up, generally they'll say, okay, you can fish harder. Biomass goes down, you know, fish as much. So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, where the science of a stock assessment starts to get turned into management actions. Again, this could be a whole talk in of itself. One of the problems I'm starting to realize we've been having in New England is we've been using a control that looks kind of like this, where you, regardless of biomass, you fish at the same fishing mortality rate until you reach a certain threshold, and then you make a drastic cut. It leads to a really disruptive, unstable, disjointed system. More and more fishery scientists are advocating something like that right-hand graph, where you actually, you make more regular and incremental changes, and you avoid these sharp discontinuities. Again, that could be talking about itself, but this is really where that last pillar, your scientific foundation, starts to get translated into harvest controls. But just because you know what fishing mortality rate you want to try to achieve, you still have to figure out how to achieve it. There's, in fisheries management, there's two general types of harvest controls: input controls and output controls, or as I've said here, input controls are about what goes in the water. You know, how much gear can you deploy? When is there an open versus closed season? How big can your boat be? Are there restrictions on the type of fish, etc.? Output controls are focused more on what's coming out. Limits on the number of fish, the size of fish, etc. This paper that Mike Melnichuk was at the University of Washington led a few years ago showed, in my view, pretty convincingly that output controls are generally better. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit here, so I won't go into the details, but what this shows is that the output controls tend to keep spawning biomass, or more likely to keep spawning biomass at or above the target, and fishing mortality below compared to the input controls. I was part of a group led by Owen Liu at UCal Santa Barbara that actually tried to look at this with a little bit of texture. So Mike's paper made this fairly coarse comparison between input controls and output controls. There's actually many different types of each. Mike was looking at the two major objectives that we're trying to achieve: biomass and fishing mortality rate. But there are actually usually many more objectives that a fishery management program is trying to achieve. So what we tried to do was say, okay, for all of these particular types of input controls and output controls against a whole range of objectives, which ones are more or less effective? And if you implement an approach that is effective at one goal, are there others that actually might not be so effective, that might even be counterproductive? So the idea here was trying to get fishery practitioners, fishery managers to think in more complex and nuanced ways about how their harvest control are implemented. Okay. The sixth pillar is having monitoring and accountability mechanisms. A few weeks ago, so very quick history of the Oceans Program at EDF where I work. For many years, our focus was wholly and solely on the U.S. Now we actually are in the midst of a significant international expansion. We actually have more work outside of the U.S. than we do in the U.S. That has taken us into several developing countries where it's a whole new ballgame. We became accustomed to the highly structured, arguably over-structured governance system that we have in the US. You move to developing countries and some of the basic resources, capacities for management, enforcement are absent. So we had to start asking ourselves, what do we need to do differently? What questions do we need to ask? What approaches do we need to put into place in those kinds of contexts? To help us get some answers, we actually invited a group of experts from well outside of the fisheries arena. So we went to groups like Oxfam, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, groups that have taken on challenges in human rights and economic development in very poor places with governance limitations, to ask them, what questions do you ask to figure out how to do your work, and what do you do differently based on the answers? One of the most, the whole reason I'm telling you this is one of the most resounding answers we got from them was accountability, accountability, accountability. Whatever your governance system is, whatever limitations you have to make sure that there's accountability for both the users and the government. And that came out in those fisheries papers as well. Monitoring the fishery and having accountability for following the rules was absolutely critical. Okay, if you guys didn't know where Nantucket is, I'm guessing you don't know who this guy is, but I'll ask anyway.
Is that the Codfather?
Yes. Okay, this is the Codfather, Carlos Rafael. I'm smiling because you knew the answer. Thinking about Carlos Rafael generally does not make me smile. Carlos Rafael was, and I am happy to say was, the single largest operator in the New England brownfish and scallop fisheries for many, many years. He owned a ton of boats, a ton of permits. He had economic and political dominance over those fisheries for many years. It turns out he was also cheating rampantly for years and years and years. His operation was highly vertically integrated, and so what he could do was basically misreport catch throughout the supply chain because he controlled all of those levels. This had massive ramifications. It screwed up our science because we were inputting catch figures into assessment models that were wrong. It caused massive distrust within the fleet and between the fleet and government. I mean, this guy single-handedly screwed a lot of people working hard to try to get fisheries right, from the fishermen, the rest of the fishermen, to the scientists, to the managers, to the environmentalists. A lot of well-intentioned people that disagree on many things and often fight fiercely about it. And it's a hard job to begin with when you don't have something like this going on. In my view, the reason he was able to get away with this is because we don't monitor our fisheries well enough. And I'm talking about at-sea catch monitoring. We do some monitoring when the catch comes back to the port, but even that's not sufficient. So we're kind of relying on a certain degree of honesty. Now, one of the things that helps is when you have a fisherman and a buyer and a distributor that are not all part of the same operation. They actually kind of need to be honest, because if you're handing bad information to the next person in the line, they could call you on it. When you own the whole supply chain, though, but I don't think you ever would have got away with this if we had independent verification of what species he was catching and where he was catching them. We never would have pulled this off. Anyways, go to jail. So, okay. One of the things, though, that's been a problem, I mean, there are legitimate problems with trying to monitor catch at sea and fishing behavior at sea, is a way that is often done is to put an observer, either a government employee or from a third-party contractor on a boat, standing there with a clipboard and measure fish and record the catch. Fishermen hate that, and some of these boats are not terribly big, and you can be tripping over this person, and there's one more bed and food. I think one of the real exciting developments in fisheries management, though, is the use of technology. New technologies being brought to bear for many things, including some of the basic science, but also to crack this nut. So this shows the view from a camera that is positioned on an arm off the side of a fishing vessel, pointed at the side of the deck where long lines are being brought over. You can snap a photo where you can see the species, these marks here let you get its length. So you can actually record the catch much more accurately. Then if for any reason fishermen decide to discard, use it. So discarding at sea is a big problem when we don't have monitors because a lot of those fish don't make it, and we don't know what was caught. Well, now we do. Whether this fisherman lands this fish or throws it overboard, we know it was caught. We know what species it is, and we know about how big it was. So that's huge. In addition, satellite technologies, vessel monitoring systems are allowing us to do things like manage remote protected areas. Based on the speed that a vessel is moving, its patterns of movement, you can actually tell if it's just steaming or fishing. So we can tell when and where vessels from all over the world are fishing. So technology is really helping us build better monitoring and accountability systems that don't rely, on having a college kid standing on the back getting in the way of all these angry fishermen. So it's a really exciting development. I think it's going to change the game. Okay, moving on. The next pillar. Ecosystem-based approaches. The sort of traditional science that goes into fisheries management is really basically applied population biology. You look at the demographic rates of a particular species, we put them into models, and we figure out what its productivity is, what its recovery potential is, etc. It actually works better than most people give it credit for. You'll hear a lot of people say that these approaches are ineffective and unrealistic because they don't account for all of the things that go on in the ecosystem. The paper I showed before that Ray Hilborn and Daniel Mondo wrote, they wrote that paper largely as a defense of single species approaches. And in my experience, there are plenty of times they work quite well. But there's other times they don't. And I think the number of instances where we need to adopt a more ecosystem-based approach that number is growing. Because our impacts on the system are growing, because conflicts and interactions among different fishing fleets and fishermen and other users are growing. So more and more, we're needing to do science and then implement management approaches that actually consider interactions. And I'm going to give an example. An example again from where I am. So this is the marine waters off the coast of the northeastern U.S. It's got an area in the middle is the Gulf of Maine. You can barely see this sort of underwater plateau. That's George's Bank. It's one of the most famous and historically productive fishing grounds in the world. There's Nantucket. I live about there on the seacoast of New Hampshire. That's where you can find my daughter. I'm putting this picture up on I miss her. Two, because if you're getting tired and bored, I figure looking at my cute daughter will start to engender some sympathy for me. And stick that to the end. Okay, so I want to talk about some of these ecosystem interactions in this area. I want to focus on three species. The alewife, which is a sea-run species of herring. So we're almost out of salmon on our coast, but we do have some rather large and many growing runs of these what we call river herrings. These are anadromous fish that spend most of their lives at sea but run up rivers to spawn. Atlantic cod, one of the most famous fish in the world. Mark Verlansky wrote a book called Cod. Some of you might have read. The subtitle was A Biography of the Fish That Changed the World. It sounds a little hyperbolic, but he actually makes a compelling case. And the American lobster, the second most valuable fishery in our region, and I think the second most valuable in the nation. So these three species interact in the water. They also are all the targets of different fishing fleets. Species themselves have predator-prey interactions. Cod is a higher level predator in the region. It eats both alewives and lobsters. There's a different kind of predator-prey interaction that takes place between these species and the fishing fleet. So what I'm trying to reflect here is green represents a positive interaction, red represents a negative interaction. So, when alewives are feeding cod, that's good for the cod, but it imposes mortality on the alewife. So there's there's not perfect reciprocity in these interactions. So we have all these predator-prey interactions going. We also have other interactions, though. Lobster traps catch cod. Cod will go in there and get stuck and come up in the trap. Conversely, groundfish trawlers will catch lobster. So those two fleets have impacts on those two species. Now, you'll notice that there's no arrow going in the opposite direction. In my view, there should be. So right now, largely because of the distrust and animosity and just politics between these two fleets, Roundfish fishermen who catch lobster can't land, at least in the state of Maine. And conversely, lobster fishermen who catch cod can't land. That hurts everybody. Because, first of all, allowing them to sell that bycatch would let them diversify their portfolios, generate some extra revenue, buffer them a little bit against declines in their target species. As a scientist, it would improve the data streams. We know more about cod mortality if we're factoring in what's caught in lobster traps. But right now, it's just kind of a one-way adverse interaction. There's also an interaction between these alewife fisheries and lobster, given that the primary use of these alewives is as bait in lobster traps. It actually means these alewife fisheries, which are incredibly small scale, and a fairly low volume catch, that actually have disproportionate importance because of the importance of the lobster fishery and the massive demand for bait. So the whole point of this is you have all these complex interactions that go on in the water and out of the water. And what it means is that, first of all, the science that we do might need to incorporate some of those species and fishery interactions. Certainly our management decisions probably should account for that. So if we, for example, increase the catch of lobster, that's probably going to cause a greater demand for alewives. That may ripple through the ecosystem and have an effect on cod by decreasing its food source. So this is kind of what these ecosystem approaches are trying to get at. It's both new scientific tools, but also management decisions that are trying to account for the interactions. And more, as fishing fleets grow, as we catch a wider range of species, and as species get depleted, I think we're going to have to be moving to these kind of approaches. Okay, the last pillar, and this is one that is particularly important to us at EDF because this is a lot of the work we try to do, which is trying to build management systems that incorporate rules for equitable access, that have the right incentive structures, and ultimately provide secure rights. This is kind of our stock when it comes to fisheries management. And I think for good reason. So there's a really positive story, I think, coming out of Belize right now. Belize is a small country but has a lot of fishermen and some really valuable fisheries. In particular, it's spiny lobster and conch fisheries, both of which have been declining. And so the Belizean government and the Belizean fishing industry recognized they need to do something different. So they worked with us and a bunch of other NGOs. I mean, this was really a diverse collaboration to fundamentally change their approach to fisheries management. And what they did was they created a series of what they call managed access zones. So now any conch or lobster fisherman in Belize is a license to fish in one of these zones and one only. Okay? Now, that actually sounds like it might be limiting. It might be limiting their opportunities, it might be reducing their flexibility, and there probably is some cost there. But what we find is that the benefits generally outweigh those costs. And the benefits are that these fishermen now have a lot more security, they have a much stronger stewardship ethic, the decision-making process has changed fundamentally, so for each of these management zones, there's now a council that is comprised of fishermen and local government officials that kind of sets and evolves the rules. So you'll actually hear some of the things I'm talking about hit on themes in some of these other pillars. It's aligning the spatial scale that's in a way that more closely matches both the socioeconomic scale and the ecological scale. It's putting in place a stronger and more participatory decision-making process. And one of the system has been in place long enough to see biological returns, but we are seeing scientific returns. The reporting rates have gone up, the data streams are getting stronger. So this to me is a really positive story about how creating the right system of access and fishing rights that generates new incentives can actually shift the trajectory of the fishery. And there have been studies that have tried to look at performance of these kinds of systems that have been in place, that have been in place for longer than the Belizean one. There's a lot here, I'm not going to go into excruciating detail, but this study looked at a series of rights-based fisheries in the US and Canada and found that by every metric they looked at, the fishery was doing better after the system went in place. So things like discards came down, revenues went up. The fishing season prior to moving toward output controls and fishing rights, a lot of these fisheries just had a set fishing season that got shorter and shorter and shorter as the stock went down and down and down. When you got rid of that approach and just managed on the basis of the quota and gave fishermen a secure allocation of it, the fishing seasons went to almost the entire year. That had big economic benefits because when you have these drastically reduced seasons, there's a lot of product coming to market at the same time, which drives the price up. Now fishermen have a lot more flexibility in when they fish. They can respond better to not only things like weather, but things like competition. If they see many of their competitors heading out, they might decide to stay back and fix nets for a day and wait until they can see a dip in supply that they're going to fill. That change also meant that the one I will point out is in the upper right. That's a safety index, which pulls together a variety of things like drownings, Coast Guard responses, violations, etc. A variety of things that indicate safety. The safety index went through the roof after the incident because the way fishermen changed, the fundamental nature of how they go about their business was drastically different and ultimately safe. It also meant that overall these fish were much, much less likely to get to that real drastic state of collapse. This study that Chris Costello and his colleagues did used the same kind of approach from that infamous 2048 paper. They said, all right, we're not saying we buy this paper, but let's look at that trend. So that's the solid line. But now let's factor out fisheries that adopt these rights-based approaches. And what you can see was they reconstructed that same trend of more and more fisheries becoming collapsed through time, except the dotted line is those that used a rights-based approach. That actually flattens out. So as more and more of these systems were put in place, as they evolved and improved, the probability of collapse became much less, and that's, to me, a really important thing. So, I'm going to start winding this up. So looking at, these kind of 10 high-profile studies and a variety of other studies that inform them, I've identified what I think are these 8 foundational pillars. Decision-making process, simply having a management plan, getting management at the right scale or scales, having a strong scientific basis, having effective harvest controls, making sure you have mechanisms for monitoring and accountability, more and more using ecosystem-based approaches, and ultimately to make it all work, having an equitable system of access, incentives, and rights. Well, are these all equal? That's a hard question to answer. This actually looks at those 10 studies and these 8 pillars and shows which ones came up in which studies. And you can see some of them came up more often than others. I'm not sure that actually reflects importance. I could make a case for some of these being more or less important, but I'm not going to do that because I actually don't think it's a useful exercise. I think the point here is that when you put a fishery management program together, ideally you want all of these in place and you want them to be as strong as possible. Just out of curiosity though, I went and looked at 2 of the most influential fishery policy documents worldwide. The FAO has produced a code of conduct for responsible fisheries. They've also produced guidelines for small-scale fisheries in particular. So I went through the recommendations in those documents and tried to see kind of which pillars they aligned with. And here's what that looked like for whatever it's worth. The blue bars are from the code of conduct. The orange ones are from the small-scale fishery guidelines. And what this reflects is the number of individual recommendations that more or less aligned with each pillar. You can see that at both of them, the decision-making process was front and center. Particularly in the small-scale fishery guidelines, though, a lot of that, at the other end of the plot, focused on access and rights, which wasn't surprising. The code of conduct also has a really strong emphasis on science and harvest controls. Again, does this mean that those pillars are more or less effective? I'm not sure. But I found that an interesting comparison on this. All right, so to finally wrap this up, are these useful? I like to think so. I think they can be useful for diagnosing fishery performance problems. if you have a fishery that's underperforming, these 8 areas might be a good starting place to see what are you missing, what can be improved. In terms of investing in fishery reforms, whether that's public or private investment, these might be areas to target. And just evaluating and perhaps revising and reforming fishery policies and governance systems. In doing that, these might be 8 areas to pay particular attention to. Now, having talked for an hour now about these 8 pillars, there's actually a lot more, though, in my view, that makes fisheries effective, that makes them work, that are not captured here. What I'm looking at is really what is included in the more formal policy, governance, and management system. But there's things like leadership, trust, social cohesion. There's been a lot of scholarship from the social sciences to demonstrate the importance of these things in making fisheries and other natural resource systems function well. Marketing and business planning. Fishermen can often do more with less if they're creative in how they market their product. Competing uses. This is really looking at the fisheries sector kind of in isolation. More and more as aquaculture develops, as offshore energy develops. When the Panama Canal was rebuilt, the size of shipping vessels started to go up. In Boston, they had to restructure the entire port to accommodate these larger vessels that can now get through the canal. Well, those vessels can get in the way of fishing grounds. They can interact with fish. So there's a lot of competing uses that are not captured here. And on that note, I'll take a breath, and if you're so inclined, answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Are your 8 pillars, is there a document that's published that has a
There's
summary of this?
Paper that I'm going to submit within the next month or 2.
Okay.
This is the first time I've actually presented this. Started working on this over the summer, and so I thought I'd try it out in an audience. Probably should have told you that.
So you mentioned earlier about how you guys are moving to start to work more in developing countries rather than just the United States. And so let's say you go to one of these countries, working in these really small villages where communal fishing is the norm. It's been going on forever, and they're starting to use dynamite fishing, electric fishing because the stocks are going down. How do you triage that situation and try to figure out what needs to go in place and help or try to convince them to change behavior? Because I feel like they're working with nested institutions.
Yeah, that's a big question. We spend a lot of time trying to evaluate, first of all, we did this at the global scale, which countries are the most important ones for us to target. But once we've made those decisions, which fisheries and or fishing communities do we want to work with? And there's a range of considerations. A community that's, using dynamite fishing and those kinds of methods, we're probably not going to touch that. There's other groups that are really focused on that. That's not quite our bread and butter. We tend to target fisheries, target fishing communities that, there's sort of a sweet spot between if the stocks are healthy and the fisheries performing well, then what needs to be done? On the other hand, if it's so far gone it's not going to come back, kind of what's the point? So there's a middle ground where the resources are not in great shape, but they have recovery potential. So that's sort of the biological consideration. And then there's a range of socioeconomic and cultural considerations. Is there a history in a given fishery or given community of working in collective partnerships with NGOs? Are there local NGOs in place? When we do our work in the U.S., we're often front and center. I showed you that photo of me chairing the major scientific committee. I've had colleagues sitting on these councils. We're very visible, and we impose ourselves on the process because, damn it, it's our right as citizens. When we go overseas, we actually more and more try to take a back seat, and we are focusing much more on capacity building in many places, training in some of those data-limited scientific approaches, training in new approaches to management, things like creating fishing organizations, putting in place, the foundations and the structures that will allow the participants in those fisheries to bring about reforms and to try to take more of a supporting role. But all of that follows a kind of careful diagnosis of is this potential opportunity going to be receptive to us, to our ideas? And are they poised to make change?
Have you read Kudlansky's book, Cod? Yeah, I don't think he mentions the Codfather in that book, so I assume
No.
it happened after it was published.
Yeah.
How's cod stock doing, especially around the Georges Bank?
Not good. Not good at all. It's there's two stocks in U.S. waters: the Gulf of Maine stock and the Georges Bank stock, and they're both at critically low levels. There's been a few signs of so one of the major inputs into these assessment models is a government trawl survey, a fishery independent trawl survey, which gives us sort of a biomass trend, and that kind of tunes the estimates coming out of the model. But just looking at that survey trend in and of itself, starting to see a little bit of an uptick in the last few years. After I talked about the policy changes that went into effect 10 years ago when the Magnuson Act was last reauthorized, that actually led to substantial reductions in fishing mortality. And so that we measured right off the bat. So we saw fishing mortality come down. Now, the stock, though, that response takes longer. Those fish need to reproduce, they need to grow. What we're learning is that climate change is affecting the Gulf of Maine more strongly than just about anywhere in the world. The warming trend there is steeper than almost any other ocean region. Cod are a cold water fish, and the Gulf of Maine is the far southern extent of their range. A lot of people think they're going to go away. I'm not sold on that yet, but it's not going to be as conducive an environment for them. And so that's one thing we're trying to factor in. So, with some of the cuts and quotas we put into place, I was expecting the population response to be faster. And I'm starting to realize it's happening, but it's going to be slow because we're cooking these fish. This is a species that is distributed right up to the Arctic. You go to the farthest north stretches of the Norwegian coast, and you can find abundant cod. That's ice cold water. This isn't so much of a cold water system anymore.
Kind of continuing that line, would you mind expanding your thoughts on the reasons for the disparity between success in the East Coast and West Coast fisheries?
Sure. I'm laughing because I often get fired up about this, and I'm not going to. Well, and Alaska is often held up, justifiably, as sort of the golden boy of fisheries management in the U.S. The stocks are in good shape. I've been to their council meetings, and I was just shocked at the level of collegiality between managers and industry and environmentalists. They do good science, they put in place forward-thinking management, and it's paying dividends. However, their fisheries have been operating for 50 years at any meaningful commercial fisheries. In New England, it's been centuries. I mean, we were the part of the country that was colonized first. So we have a longer history of commercial fishing, we have a longer history of coastal development, we have a longer history of watershed management or mismanagement and manipulation. Alaska, the Bering Sea is many times the size of the Gulf of Maine, bound by one state. We have 5 states crammed into a little place with high population density, so it's incredibly politically convoluted. It's got a long history of impacts. Part of the reason Alaska is so successful is because they've seen all the mistakes we make and started doing them differently from the outset. And good for them for that. I mean, it's, I'm shocked often at how rare it is for people to learn lessons from others' mistakes, and they did. So they're doing good things. A lot of the changes that were put in place when the Magnuson Act was reformed were based on things that were being done already in Alaska. So we kind of started to expand that model as we should. So I applaud their success, but sometimes, while Alaska's the golden boy, New England can kind of be the black sheep or the whipping boy or whatever metaphor you want to use. And in some ways we deserve it, but in other ways I think people need to appreciate we have a harder task. We started doing fisheries management after 200 years of fishing. In Alaska, commercial fishing and fisheries management began at the same time. You know, yes. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
Yeah, so my question is about the accountability you have mentioned. So there are like regions that have like territorial disputes, for example, across China Sea, and fishery is still a like big industry there. So how are you getting like all parties on board, and how can you like really hold them accountable instead of like letting them to fish too much?
Yeah, I'm not going to have a good answer to that question. I mean, the South China Sea is such a hot button place. I could give examples from other places. Actually, I think New England is actually a good example here. So one of the things I think we do pretty well in New England is manage what we call straddling stocks. These are stocks, populations whose distribution cuts across multiple jurisdictions. I mean, it's why these RFMOs exist. In the Gulf of Maine, there's a line called the Hague Line, which sort of bisects the Gulf of Maine, and that's the international boundary between the US and Canada. The fish don't know where that line is, and so many of the stocks we're trying to assess and manage exist on both sides. The US and Canada have actually entered into what I think is a fairly forward-thinking agreement, where they jointly do the assessments, then allocate the quota coming out of it between the two countries based on a formula that combines the historical importance of a given species to each country and the current distribution. And that formula changes through time so that the weight of the historical piece gets less, whereas the contemporary distribution gets more. So I thought it was a really clever way of not causing a major disruption. So a species like yellowtail flounder, for example, which is one of these transboundary stocks. For many years, the Canadians hadn't been fishing it much. The U.S., it was a really important part of the groundfish fishery, and over time, it's become a part of the scallop fishery because they catch it as bycatch. So when this agreement went into place, a lot of the yellowtail flounder allocation went to the U.S. because at that moment, we needed it more than they did. However, as waters warm, that stock is drifting more into Canadian waters. And so it's becoming more available to Canadian fishermen, and they want to be able to exploit it. So the formula tries to account for that. It downplays the historical importance to the U.S. and increases the weighting of the distribution shifting into Canada. So anyway, I'm not sure that quite answers the question. I jumped to a fairly, a much easier problem. Two countries. Trying to manage a shared stock as opposed to the South China Sea is really like, where is that line in the first place? And I'm not sure how we're going to crack that nut. China is one of the countries that the EDF is starting to work more on. And in fact, my own work is drastically shifting to have a heavy focus on China. I am doing my damnedest to stay as far from that particular issue as I can, at least from the outset. If you have any ideas, I'm looking.
Yeah, I had a question going back to Alaska actually. So I've been keeping up on the news with bubble mine a little bit up there and how that could be impacting the salmon industry potentially, and that a lot of environmental groups are getting really up and angry about it. But I was wondering what EDF's involvement in that case was.
Hasn't been much. When I joined our oceans program, it was a much smaller program, maybe 20 people working on 20 different things. And a few years after I joined, we made a major strategic decision. One, to grow the program substantially. We tripled our staff in about a 2-year period, but also to narrow our focus substantially. And so we had been working on all sorts of issues, not pebble line, but we've been working on offshore oil and gas and beach renourishment and dams and fish passage and you name it. Pushed all that aside and decided to really focus on fisheries management. And that has meant, more often than not, avoiding other impacts on fish stocks, working primarily within the fishery management and governance arena, and therefore picking projects to work on where fishing is in fact a major impact. In the U.S., pebble mine accepted, when we're talking about federally managed species like cod, today, a lot of the impacts I talked about with coastal development and damming and all that, first of all, we're actually starting to improve some of that stuff. But a lot of that damage has been done. The biggest ongoing impact for many offshore species is fishing. But if there was a situation, you know, where a non-fishing impact was affecting fish stock more than fishing was, chances are we actually just wouldn't choose to engage there. There's no sense spending a lot of time and effort to improve the fishery management program that's actually being slumped by, you know, a nickel mine or poor, agricultural management or whatever it is. So it's probably not a satisfying answer. But, you know, remember, we are one of many environmental groups out there, and we do this ourselves and with colleagues, kind of regularly taking stock of what the community as a whole is working on. So we know we only have so much time, so much staff, so much money. We can't tackle all the problems in the world, even just the fishery problems. So we pick our targets as best we're able, but also kind of check in on what other groups are doing to make sure that as a whole, the environmental community is trying to cover all the bases.
One last question.
The groundfish fishery of the West Coast here is one of the most sustainable fisheries in the US and maybe in the world. Just like thinking about it on top of my head, it means most, if not all, of the big pillars that you have. A lot of groundfish species are already greenwest at the Monterey Aquarium and Seafood program. There's a lot of groundfish in the water, but there are too many financial and regulatory constraints for fishermen to fish them. And so it's how do we manage or balance fishery, fish, and fishermen as we evolve towards a very good, very well managed fisheries.
That's a great question, and I'm not much of an expert on the West Coast groundfish fishery. I know enough to be dangerous. And my understanding is that one of the biggest problems in that fishery, so I talked about the difference between input control and output control, how switching from input controls to output controls is generally better. Layer on top of that some kind of a secure fishing rights system is doing better. That's exactly what this fishery did, except as I understand it, left in place many of those input controls. So talking to my colleagues who do work on that fishery, what I hear from them is, they've made all these improvements, but the fleet is being held back because they still have what are probably unnecessary regulations still on the books. So I think a lot of people who worked on putting that new system into place and have worked on refining it are actually finding what they really need to do is go back and look at all these kind of legacy regulations that might not be needed anymore. We actually have some of that in the inland groundfish fishery as well. We went to a fishing rights system. The problem is, though, because of the monitoring, we have woefully inadequate monitoring. So if there's one pillar that in my view is weakest in New England, it is the accountability. And it may be to the point that it's really causing the whole system to almost fail. That's overstating it a bit. There's been some analysis done to try to estimate what would be the economic status of the fishery today, given the status of the resources, given the law we're working under, if we hadn't made that change. And the fact of the matter is it would be much, much, much worse. So it's a struggling fishery, but doing better than it might have otherwise. But it still suffers from too little accountability, which in some people's minds means you actually need to keep some of those legacy input controls around as a sort of a buffer. I'm not sure that's true. I don't think that case has been terribly well made. But anyway, that's my understanding is that it's one of the big issues in this fishery.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Jacob.